Okay, how's it going? Good morning. We're going to do Apollonius. That's Apollonius of Tyana, or Tyana. I think it's pronounced Tyana. And spell it for you. That's Apollonius, Apollonius of Tyana, Tyana. And this is Antiquity Unveiled, page 17. Apollonius of Tyana, the Jesus of Nazareth, St. Paul, and John the Revelator of the Christian Scriptures, returns to earth as a spirit and explains the mysteries that have concealed the theological deception of the Christian hierarchy. Before entering upon this all-absorbing subject, it is simply proper, by way of explanation, to inform the reader that previous to the date given below, Mr. Roberts had been having regular weekly sittings with the medium through whom communications were received, but in reference to the sitting on May 25th, 1881, Mr. Roberts records in his notes the following: having been informed who would next manifest through the medium, the time having arrived, I felt a thrill of astonishment and delight of the greatest intensity, and the very air of the humble apartment in which we sat seemed filled with a mighty spiritual power as the name Apollonius of Tyana was announced, and we greeted for the first time by the great Capodian sage and philosopher, and we were greeted for the first time by the great Capodian sage and philosopher, as well as the greatest teacher and benefactor that ever drew to himself the love, admiration, and reverence of the civilized world. Apollonius, the spirit-anointed Christ of the Orient. His communication was as follows. And here is the spirit testimony of Apollonius. Let our salutation be the survival of truth and its conquest of superstition. I was born, according to the Christian calendar, on the 16th day of February, AD 2, of wealthy parents, was educated until my 26th year in general philosophy and literature, when I served for 6 years under Euxenes, Euxenes, of Heraclea, Heracleia, learning the Pythagorean philosophy. After acquiring all I could learn from the teachings of that philosopher, I went to Antioch, and from there to Jerusalem. On account of some wonderful physical manifestations of spirit power taking place through my then young mediumship, which persons living in Jerusalem had heard of, my entrance to that city was hailed, as it has been alleged the entrance of Jesus of Nazareth was hailed, with hosannas and songs of praise to one who came in the name of the Lord. And now, mark particularly what I say. This took place when I was 33 years of age. I want you to pay the closest attention to what I shall here set forth. You will, by examining Josephus's work, War of the Jews, see that concerning the siege of Jerusalem, a certain prophecy was given, or words were spoken, as is alleged, by Jesus of Nazareth, which were fulfilled. You will find what I refer to in Matthew 23rd chapter and 35th verse, where the so-called Jesus is made to have asserted that that generation were guilty of all the blood that had been shed from Abel to Zacharias, the son of Baruch, Baroch, slain between the temple and the altar exactly 34 years after the alleged death of Jesus. And you will find this prophecy then fulfilled, while Jesus is made to have said that it was fulfilled in his time. And here you have an example of the unauthenticity of the Christian Gospels. All this I learned at the very time at which Flavius Josephus wrote the history of the War of the Jews. For I was employed and used by the Emperor Vespasian as his oracle, when in the same state as the medium is who now sits before you. Never during my mortal life did I desire to be worshipped. After death, never did I, as a mortal man, teach such a doctrine, but I was deified after my death. 9 epistles were made a present to me by Pharaoh of Taxilia, India, or rather between Babylon and India, who was a satrap in those days. Those epistles contained all that is embraced in the present epistles claimed to have been written by St. Paul, and from what I have learned as a spirit, I conclude that I am both the Jesus and St. Paul of the Christian Scriptures. Flattering enough to my vanity, but the ruin of my happiness. It is my duty here to confess all I can bring to recollection, in order that spiritual darkness may disperse and the light of truth shine in. There is one thing that I desire particularly to speak of, and that is the ultimate of spirit power on earth. All materialists claim that it is impossible to restore that which is dead to life. Upon this point, upon my own knowledge, I assert that if you have developed your mortal body to that extent, not into what is called moral purity, but into a holy, trusting love with a heart that beats for humanity, if such a person can come in contact with a fresh, young body from which the spirit has been driven out before it could accomplish its mission, take that body by the hand and with mighty will arrest that spirit, he can force it back to the body it once inhabited and make it fulfill its mission. 3 things are necessary to do this. First, a perfectly healthy organism. That does not imply a strong, powerful one. It means an organism in which the spirit is greater than the body, the excess of spirit producing this result. Here's inserted brackets and says, here the controlling spirit caused the form of the medium to rise, and extending his arms at full length to the right and left, said, the spirit addressing you is not confined to the limits of the form you see before you. It not only fills the physical organism you see, but extends far around it as well. In the time when I lived in mortal form, the old was dying out and the new being born. By this, I mean that the superstition, gods, and all such ideas were on the wane, and man was seeking, as he is today, for something more practical and beneficial. It was not through any qualities that I possessed different from or superior to those of any other man that I accomplished what I did, but through the spiritual power within and with me. This fact I want to have especially marked. The highest sensitive mortals living in any age or generation, and who are living the nearest in accord with nature's divine law of truth, will bring forth a child who may be the so-called savior of that generation. Those men and women who utter the highest and most beneficial truths to their fellow mortals are the saviors of their time. Further, I have this to say. I retired voluntarily, for I was neither ostracized nor banished for anything I had done, said, or written, to the same island to which, as is alleged, the St. John of Revelations went in the years 69 and 70 A.D. I there wrote what occurred through me in a trance state, not knowing what I wrote, an almost identical story with that attributed to the so-called St. John the Revelator. That story was nothing more than an attempt of the spirit world to give the truth of spirit life through a mortal organism in a day and generation that was not ripe to receive it. That is, the medium chosen for the expression of the teaching of spirits was too much imbued with the mysticism of Judea and neighboring countries to be well suited for that purpose. What is known to you moderns as the Anti-Nicene Library contained documents, some of which are still extant, that fully warrant you in challenging the translators of today as to the correctness of their production. Let them examine, if they dare, the manuscripts referred to, and they will find what is now being published erroneous in many particulars. They have followed too much what their ancestors translated without having translated for themselves. Now and here, I declare, the Christian Gospels were all preached by me, preached at Jerusalem, preached at Ephesus, preached at Athens, preached at Philippi, preached at Rome, preached at Antioch, preached at Alexandria, preached at Babylon. In all those countries I preached, and by manipulations and certain qualities developed in me, I healed the sick, restored the sight of the blind, and, in the way herein set forth, even raised the dead. I will try to make this raising of the dead plainer. If a child, a youth, or a maiden, whose body is fresh, full of vigor and perfection, and whose spirit has become detached from it, in that case, I hold that one whose power is great and whose will is indomitable, while that body is yet warm, can cause the spirit to return and continue to inhabit that organism. In this way, I know the dead can be restored to life. When I lived on earth, all the philosophers who taught men to expect redemption, according to more ancient authorities, taught that such redemption was to happen at that time. From what I have been able to learn as a spirit, I was the person who was designated by spirits to fulfill that mission. I claim no preeminence over anyone. I only say that my mortal body contained more spirit than the average of men, or even the most highly developed among them. At the time I existed in mortal flesh. My history, as it has come down to you moderns, written by one Damis, D-A-M-I-S, and by others afterwards, in regard to the main incidents of my life, is correct. But in regard to the glamour, romance, and mystery of the narrative, it has no relation to me whatever. The latter was the work of my disciples and followers after my death, and was promulgated by them. One thing more, and I am through with my communication. It is this: almost every picture that in modern times is recognized as the likeness of Jesus is the identical portrait of Apollonius of Tyana, painted in the reign of Vespasian. That emperor consulted me. I was the oracle in his camp. I was the means of saving the life of Flavius Josephus. Brackets, they say, we here asked him how it came down that Josephus had made no mention of the fact in his Jewish war, and he replied, the Jewish hierarchy of that day had a horror and dislike of even their best friends who were not of their faith, and Josephus, being a Pharisee of the straitest sect, was even more than usually prejudiced against a Gentile like myself. But by this I do not mean that the Pharisees were bad people, but that they were so devoted to their religion as to be bitterly bigoted and prejudiced against those who differed from them. It is my opinion, from all I can learn as a spirit, that all the Christian Gospels are borrowed from, and in fact, that their origin was the books that I brought from India, obtained part from Pharaohs, who was king of Taxilia. I think those books were used by the Platonists and the Eclectics and the Gnostics of Alexandria about 150 years after. I died in the year AD 99 at Ephesus and was 97 or 98 years of age, although some have enlarged that period of my earthly life to 150 years. The originals of the four Gospels I obtained through one Hiram Ormandi, and that's Hirame and Ormandi, Ermandi, of Taxilia, who took me forward into farther India. They were written in characters not unlike those used by the Chinese on thin, tough paper. They treated of four stages of the life of Buddha, the first to his incarnation and birth, the second to his childhood and youth, the third to his mature life, and the fourth to his old age and death. These books I obtained at Singapore, at the extreme point of India, on the strait between India and Sumatra. Brackets, they say, we here mention to him the fact that 1 week before we had received a communication from a spirit purporting to be Ulfilas, Ulphilas, the Christian bishop of the Goths, who said he had translated from Samaritan manuscripts the epistles and gospels to which he, Apollonius, had referred in the Gothic tongue, and that the manuscripts that he translated were the writings of himself after the originals he obtained at Singapore, India, to which he replied, one Hegesippus made copies from my translations and modified versions of the originals in the Samaritan tongue, and Ulfilas copied from the manuscripts of Hegesippus. I wrote in the Hebraic Samaritan tongue, which was the language of my country. Here the control of the medium became wholly exhausted. So that was the spirit testimony of Apollonius of Tyana, and Manning picks up here. Here the control of the medium became wholly exhausted, bidding us a hasty and most benign adieu. He left the medium more exhausted than we had ever seen him at any previous sitting. No other control of the medium was possible, and thus ended a spirit interview, which is destined to mark an era in which human progress never transcended, if ever equaled, in importance and interest to all classes of the human race. We publish such facts as are conceded by ample authority to be historically established concerning Apollonius. There is much that it would be desirable to add as a result of our own researches, but we will confine ourselves mainly to the current history of his life and labors. As the best condensed sketch of the life of Apollonius that we have been able to find, we have chosen that of the Penny Cyclopedia, London, 1834. We feel that we may safely assume as true and proven the following historical statements concerning Apollonius. He was born of wealthy parents at Tyana in Cappadocia, and that's spelled Cappadocia, at the very period when it is alleged the Christian Jesus was born at Bethlehem. At the age of 12 years, he was sent to Tarsus in Sicilia, the alleged birthplace and a home of St. Paul. Not liking the frivolous habits of the people of that city, with his father's consent, he retired to Aegae, it's Aegae, a town a short distance from Tarsus, where he remained until after attaining to man's estate. There he studied every system of philosophy and perfected himself in the rhetoric and general literature. There he took up his residence in the temple of Asclepius. I'll spell that. It's Aesculapius, so famed for its miraculous cures, was initiated by the priests of that temple in their mysteries, and performed cures that astonished not only the people, but even those masters of the art of healing. He there finally decided to adopt the philosophy of Pythagoras, Pythagoras, and vigorously observed the trying discipline instituted by the Samian sage. He performed the terrible task of 5 years' silence, which he endured cheerfully and without a murmur of complaint. He abstained from animal food, wine, and women, lived upon fruits and herbs, dressed only in linen garments of the plainest construction, went barefooted and with uncovered head, and wore his hair and beard uncut. He was especially distinguished for his beauty, his genial bearing, his uniform love and kindness, and his imperturbable equanimity of temper. In these respects, he was the personal embodiment of the imagery traits of the Christian Jesus, and was no doubt the original of the pictures of the so-called Nazarene, now so venerated by the uninformed professors of the Christian religion. Determined to devote himself to the pursuit of knowledge and the teaching of philosophy, he gave away his large patrimony to his poor relatives and went to Antioch, then a center of learning, but little less noted than Athens or Alexandria. There he began his great mission by teaching philosophy to a number of disciples and to the people. He entered the temple of Apollo Daphne at Antioch and learned the mysteries of its priesthood. Philostratus, Philostratus, describes the style of speaking adopted by Apollonius thus, quotes, Apollonius used a style of speaking not elevated nor swollen, in the language of poetry, nor yet one too refined, nor too Attic, for whatever exceeded the Attic mediocrity was considered by him dissonant and unpleasant. He made use of no fastidious nicety in the division of his discourses, nor any fine-spun sentences, nor was he known to adopt an ironical manner, nor any kind of apostrophizing with his hearers. He spoke, as it were, from a tripod, to wit, I know, and it seems to me, and to what purposes is this, and you must know. His sentences were short and adamantine, his words authoritative and adapted to the sense, and the bare utterance of them conveyed a sound as if they were sanctioned by the sceptre of royalty. Being asked once by a subtle disputant why he did not propose what side of a question he should take in argument, he replied, When I was a young man, I used to follow that practice, but that is no longer necessary, as it has now become my duty not to investigate, but to teach the result of my investigations. When he was asked by the same logician how a wise man should speak, he said, as a legislator, for it was the part of a legislator to command the multitude to do what he himself was convinced ought to be done. In this way, he conducted himself at Antioch and converted many who were strangers to his knowledge. Now, when it is remembered that this description of the style in which Apollonius spoke was written by Damius, the friend, pupil, and companion of the Capodian sage, long before Jesus Christ or the Christian scriptures were heard or thought of, it is not remarkably evident that the original author of those scriptures was Apollonius himself. Rather, is it not remarkably evident that the original author of those scriptures was Apollonius himself? If identifying of the style and sentiment is possible, then was the learned Apollonius the original author of the teachings attributed to Jesus Christ, an identity that all the altering, eliminating, and interpolating by the Christian hierarchy have not been able to destroy nor even imperfectly conceal. Quoting Cudworth, Dr. Lardner, in quotes, The Credibility of the Gospel History, says, Cudworth, in his Intellectual System, says, it is a thing highly probable, if not unquestionable, that Apollonius of Tyana, shortly after the publication of the Gospel to the world, was a person made choice of by the policy and assisted by the powers of the kingdom of darkness, for doing some things extraordinary, merely out of design to derogate from the miracles of our Savior Jesus Christ, and to enable paganism the better to bear up against the attacks of Christianity. So Cudworth, and I suppose that many learned men of the late times, may have expressed themselves in a like manner, but I cannot assent to them. He further cites Hewitt as follows. He, Philostratus, aimed, says Hewitt, and thinks it to have been his principal design, to obstruct the progress of the Christian religion by drawing the character of a man of great knowledge, sanctity, and miraculous power. Therefore, he formed Apollonius after the example of Christ, and accommodated many things in the history of our Lord to Apollonius. End of quotes. Thus we see that the very learned and pious Christian Hewitt was forced to admit the common identity of Apollonius and Jesus, the first described by Philostratus according to the memoirs of Damis, made in the 1st century, and the latter described by no one knows whom or when, but certainly not earlier than the beginning of the 3rd century of the so-called Christian era, as now contained in what is called the New Testament, as Christian writers have been forced to admit the identity of the respective narratives concerning Apollonius and Jesus. The only question that remains to be settled is which was the original author of the so-called Christian teachings. If this has not already been fully done, there remains very little yet to be done to complete the demonstration that Apollonius of Tyana was the author, and not Jesus of Nazareth, nor Paul of Tarsus, as is wrongly claimed by Christian writers. After stating many reasons for his conclusions, Dr. Lardner, than whom there is no higher Christian authority, says, it is manifest, therefore, that Philostratus compared Apollonius and Pythagoras, but I do not see that he endeavored to make him a rival with Jesus Christ. Philostratus has never once mentioned our Savior, or the Christians his followers, neither in this long work nor in the lives of the sophists, if it be his, as some learned men of the best judgment suppose, nor is there any hint that Apollonius anywhere in his wide travels met with any followers of Jesus. There is not so much as an obscure or general description of any men met with by him, whom any can suspect to be Christians of any denomination, either Catholics or heterics. Whereas I think if Philostratus had written with a mind adverse to Jesus, he would have laid hold of some occasion to describe and disparage his followers as enemies to the gods and contemners of the mysteries and solemnities, and different from all other men. Let it be remembered that Philostratus lived and wrote his life of Apollonius in the reign of Septimus Severus, Septimus Severus, about the beginning of the 3rd century AD. At that time, there could not possibly have been in existence any of the scripture narratives of the life of Jesus Christ so nearly analogous to the incidents and events which he related concerning Apollonius. Had there been such persons living as Jesus Christ and his apostles and their Christian followers during the time that Apollonius lived and labored throughout the then civilized world, Damus, who accompanied him during much of that time and who recorded everything worthy of a special note, would have made some mention of such people, either favorably or unfavorably. That he did not do so is of itself sufficient proof that neither Jesus Christ, his apostles, nor the Christian religion had an existence either before or during that period, which was the only time in which they could have had a real existence. At all events, nothing can be more certain than the conclusion of Dr. Lardner that Philostratus did not write the life of Apollonius to disparage the Christian religion. But Dr. Lardner is not content to make that fatal acknowledgment of the Christian plagiarism of the life and labors of Apollonius, but makes an equally fatal acknowledgment in another direction, in disagreeing with Cudworth, Hewitt, and others as to the life of Apollonius by Philostratus having been written to oppose Christianity. Dr. Lardner says, quote, "With due submission, I do not think that Apollonius was a man of so great importance, as is here supposed, for it does not appear that any adversaries of the Christians, either Celsus or Porphyry, or any other before Heracles, at the beginning of the 4th century, under Diocletian's persecution, ever took any notice of him in any of their arguments, nor do I know that he has been once mentioned by any Christian writers of the first 2 centuries. When I first met with the observation of Cudworth, hereinbefore given, I was very much surprised, considering the silence of all early antiquity. If this observation were right, I should have expected to find frequent mention of Apollonius in the history of St. John and other apostles of Christ, but there is none. We had in that space of time divers learned men, some of them as eminent for extensive literature as any men that ever lived, as Justin, Tatian, Bardasanes, the Syrian, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, Julius, Africanus, Tertullian, Minucius, Felix. Do not insist on Clement of Rome, Ignatius, or Polycarp, or the histories of them. Of all these we have some remains. They lived in the first 2 centuries, or the beginning of the 3rd. But of Apollonius they have not taken the least notice." Very true. And this is back to Manning. Very true, Dr. Lardner. And why did they not do so? that total silence on the part of those authors of the 1st and 2nd centuries regarding so eminent a philosopher and teacher as was Apollonius of Tyana can be accounted for upon but one theory, and that will show that it was a necessity to utterly ignore Apollonius and his philosophical and religious teachings in order that the Christian religion could gain a foothold to usurp the field he had so grandly occupied. Of all the authors named by Dr. Lardner, the complete works of none of them have come down to us. Besides, the fragmentary remains of the works of the first 3 centuries that have reached us have had to pass through the hands of Eusebius, Pope Sylvester I, and their coadjutors and successors, who, from the beginning of the 4th century downward to the time when the art of printing ended it, were so assiduously engaged in interpolating, mutilating, and destroying every trace of evidence within their reach that showed the real origin and nature of the Christian religion. It should have struck the attention of Dr. Lardner with vastly greater force that nowhere in the books of the New Testament is there a single mention made of Apollonius. If we expect in a few verses of 1 Corinthians, where it says, "For while one saith, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are ye not carnal? Who then is Paul, and who Apollos, but ministers by whom ye believed, even as the Lord gave to every man? I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase." End of quote. In a very ancient manuscript of the epistle found in a monastery of France by a Huguenot soldier called the Codex Beza, it's Beza, the name is not Apollos, but Apollonius. But even this positive clue to the identity of Apollonius with the St. Paul of the Christians was attempted to be obliterated by substituting Apollos for Apollonius, as it originally stood. This studied avoidance of all mention of Apollonius in the Christian scriptures is positive proof that his recognition, in any way whatever, by the authors of Christianity would be fatal to their scheme of deception and fraud. We wonder they had not had the cunning to obliterate that one reference. We wonder they had not had, I think it's supposed to say, we wonder had they not had the cunning to obliterate that one reference to the preaching and teaching of Apollonius, and the admission that his teaching was in perfect accord with the teachings attributed to St. Paul. It is an old saying that liars should have good memories. This was never more apparent than in the one oversight of not eliminating that telltale confession from the first epistle to the Corinthians. There it stands, and there it will stand, thanks to the art of printing, to confound those Christian enemies of truth and make clear the fraud they are upholding. Dr. Lardner further says, the first Christian writer who has mentioned him, Apollonius, so far as I can recollect, is Origen, Origen, in his books against Celsus, Celsus, written not long before the middle of the 3rd century, when he says, "He who would not know whether magic has any power over philosophers may read the memoirs of Morigenes concerning Apollonius of Tyana, both a magician and a philosopher, in which Morigenes, Moeragenes, who is not a Christian, but a philosopher, says that some, and no inconsiderable philosophers, were taken by the magical art of Apollonius, and came to him as a magician. Among them, I suppose he means Euphrates and a certain Epicurean, Epicurean. But we can affirm upon the ground of our own experience that they who worship the God over all through Jesus Christ, and live accordingly to the gospel, and pray as they ought to do day and night, have no reason to fear anything from magic. So Origen is led to speak in that answer to some things in Celsus, but it does not appear that Celsus had at all mentioned either Apollonius or his historian. Apollonius is mentioned by Lucian, but what he says of him is far from being to his advantage. He is also mentioned by Apuleius, Apuleius, who was contemporary with Lucian. Nor is there any other older author now extant where he is mentioned, which must be reckoned in argument of his great obscurity, till he was set up by Philostratus. After that time Apollonius is taken notice of by many, as Arnobius and Lactantius and Eusebius, who were led to observe upon Heracles, whose whole book against the Christians was founded on the memoirs of Philostratus. He is afterwards mentioned by Augustine, Augustin, and other Christian writers. Yeah, that's meant to be Augustine. Anyway. And other Christian writers. And he is mentioned several times by the writers of the Augustan history, who flourished in the time of the Diocletian, Diocletian, or soon afterwards, and by Dion Cassius, and by Eunapius, who commends the history of Philostratus, but says that instead of entitling it the Life of Apollonius, he might have called it the Peregrination of a God Among Men. That's Peregrination of a God Among Men. Peregrination. Okay. So here we have Manning talking back. Now it must not be forgotten that the writings of Celsus were lost or destroyed long since, nothing being known of what they were, except as Origen, Origen, has reported them. Whether Celsus did or did not mention Apollonius is a matter of no consequence. Celsus did not write until nearly a century after the death of Apollonius, and may never have met with the memoirs of Damis or Morigenus concerning Apollonius. That Lucian and Apuleius, who wrote while Apollonius still lived, or soon after his death, should have mentioned him, is sufficient to establish his historical existence. Philostratus, who had not then come into possession of the memoirs of Damis, Morigenus, and Maximus of Aegis, and the history of the life and labors of Apollonius, had been suppressed, no doubt by the influence of the priesthoods of Greece and Rome. The desire of the cultured Empress Julia Domina to learn the history of Apollonius shows that he was not unknown to fame as a distinguished philosopher as late as the beginning of the 3rd century, when Philostratus wrote his life of Apollonius. As admitted by Dr. Lardner, all through the 3rd century, there was frequent mention of his name and teachings, but it was not until Heracles, in the beginning of the 4th century, boldly charged upon the Christian priesthood their plagiarism of the teaching and works of Apollonius, that the latter found it necessary to set every means at work that could in any way to help conceal the great truth that Heracles proclaimed with such portentous force. Portentous. It is true that no one now knows exactly what it was that Heracles wrote, for Eusebius, who took upon himself the task of destroying the testimony of Heracles, took precious good care to destroy the work of his formidable opponent and to give his own version of the matter instead. The reply of Eusebius to Heracles has come down to us. Why has not Heracles' arraignment of the Christian priesthood also come down to us? Let that priesthood answer. We can in no way more effectually show the effect which the life of Apollonius of Tyana by Philostratus had upon the Christian priesthood and clergy than to cite the observations of Dr. S. Parker, D.D., Archdeacon of Canterbury, published 1681. We copy it from Mr. Lardner's works. They are as follows. But the man of wonders is Apollonius Tyanius, of whom they boast and insult as the true heathen messiahs, in that he wrought not, as Vespasian did, 1 or 2 chance miracles, but his whole life was all prodigy, and equal to our Saviour's, both for the number and the wonder of his works. But here first we have not in part shown what undoubted records we have of the life of Jesus, whereas all the credit of Apollonius, his history, depends upon the authority of one single man, who besides that he lived 100 years after him, ventured nothing, as the apostles did, in confirmation of the truth, but only composed it in his study, thereby, as appears from his frequent digressions, to take occasion of communicating to the world all the learning he had raked together. Nay, so far was he from incurring any loss by the work, that he was set upon it by a great empress, whose religious zeal in the cause would be sure to see him well rewarded. And though he made use of the commentaries of Damis, the inseparable companion of Apollonius, yet he confesses that Damis himself never published his commentaries, but that a friend of Damis communicated them to the empress, which himself probably might have forged, as is common in courts, to pick her pocket. However, as for Damis himself, it is evident from Philostratus, his whole story, that he was a very simple man, and that Apollonius only picked him up as a fit Sancho Panza to exercise his wit upon, so that upon all occasions we find him not only baffling the esquire in disputes, but breaking jests upon him, which he always takes with much thankfulness and more humility, still admiring his master's wisdom, but much more his wit. But after all, what the story of Damis was, or whether there was ever any such story, we have no account, unless from Philostratus himself, and therefore we must resolve it all into his own authority alone. And there it is evident that Apollonius was neither a god nor a divine man, as his friends boasted, nor a magician or conjurer, as his enemies imagined, but a mere fanatic and pedantic, Pedantic, Pythagorean, who for the honor of his sect traveled, as many others have done, into all parts of the world, and when he returned home, told his countrymen that all men renowned for wisdom all the world over were of the sect of the Pythagoreans, and then, for advancement of their authority, told strange and prodigious tales of their wonder-working power. Through here either he or his historian has acquitted himself so awkwardly as utterly to spoil the tale and defeat the design. This Eusebius has shown at large in his book against Heracles, by taking to pieces of all parts of the story and discovering all its flaws and incoherences. But I shall content myself with proving the vanity of the whole from the notorious falsehood of one particular narration, upon which depends all that extraordinary power which he pretends to, and that is his conversation with Indian Brahmins, from whom, if we may believe his account of himself, he learned all that he could do, more than the common philosophers of Greece. And if this prove a romance, all the rest of his history must avoidably follow its fortune. Here some of the most trivial things related by Damis are cited to show that the Brahmins of India imparted nothing worth knowing to Apollonius. And then he continues, that is the most I can make of the story, though I know that Huetius, Huetius, is of an opinion that all the substantial miracles are stolen out of the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, and that for the most part, in the words and phrases of St. Luke, and this he has endeavored to make good by a great variety of parallel instances, and thinks it a manifest discovery both of the vanity of Philostratus and of the imposture of Apollonius, where he is only adorned with borrowed feathers, but a great accession to the credit of our Saviour, that when his enemies would frame the idea of a divine man, they were forced to steal their best feathers from his pictures, so that, he says, it is no wonder that Heracles should so confidently compare the miracles of Apollonius to those of Jesus, when those of Jesus were so little disguise clapped upon Apollonius. Quote, this were a pretty discovery if it stood upon good grounds, but alas, most of the parallelisms are so forced, or so slender, or so far-fetched, that it were easy to make as many and as probable between any other histories whatever, and indeed in such a design as this of Philostratus, viz., to make up a story as full of strange things as he could contrive, it is scarcely possible not to have hit upon some things like some of those miracles which are recorded in the Gospels, so that in some few of them there may be some resemblance, as particularly there seems to be in that of Gardene de Manic, and that's Gadeaemoniac, and the Corcyraean youth, Corcyan youth. Yet it is very obvious to apprehend that this might happen, not by design, but by chance, and whereas Huetius, Huetius, will needs have it that Philostratus has stolen not only the stories, but the very words of St. Luke, I find no instance of it, only in this one relation where they both, it seems, use the word Basanician, Basanichein, and this they might easily do without theft or imitation, it being the common Greek word that signifies torment, so they could no more avoid that in Greek. So that they could no more avoid that in Greek than we could this in rendering it into English. Nay, setting aside this one story, I find no resemblance between the history of Philostratus and that of the Gospels, that I scarce know any two stories more unlike, for it is obvious to any man that reads Philostratus that his whole design was to follow the train of the old heathen mythology, and that it is the bottom of his folly by his story to gain historical credit to the fables of the poets, so that it is a very true story and just censure when Ludovus Vives has given him, that he has endeavored to imitate Homer, so he had abundantly outlied him. For there is scarcely anything extraordinary reported in the whole history in which he does not apparently design either to verify or to rectify some of that blind ballad singer's tale, but especially in conjuring Achilles out of his tomb and discoursing with him about the old stories that were told of the Trojan War. And yet, after all, few of Apollonius's miracles are sufficiently vouched, even in his own history, v.g., the last that I mentioned of the apparition of Achilles, which had no other testimony but of Apollonius himself, who stubbornly refused to have any companions or witnesses of the fact, beside many other absurdities in the story itself, as his rising out of the tomb 5 feet long, and then swelling to twice the length, his being forced to vanish away at cock crowing, and the nymphs constantly visiting him. And so again, he pretended to understand all languages without learning any. This is a positive misstatement on the part of Dr. Parker, and yet when he came to the Indian king, he was forced to converse with him by an interpreter. And whereas the story tells us of the devil's being cast out of a young man by a mandate from the Brahmins, yet it gives us no account of the event of it, only they pretended to do it. But whether it was effectually done, we do not find that either Apollonius or Damis ever inquired. But the great miracle of all was his vanishing away at his trial before Domitian, in the presence of all the great men of Rome. But then, though our historian be very desirous we would believe it, yet he falters afterwards like a guilty liar in his confidence. For whereas at first he positively affirms that he quite vanished away, at last he only says that he went away, and this, though he would seem to affirm that it was after a wonderful manner, and nobody knows how, is a pitiful abatement to the benignness of his former expression, vanishing away, though the truth is, if he stood to it, it must have unavoidably proved itself a lie. For it is utterly incredible that so strange a thing as that should have been done in so great a presence, and yet never any notice taken of it. But in the last place, the historian would fain to bid at something of his hero's appearing after death, yet he does it so faintly that in the conclusion of all it becomes to nothing, especially when he tells us that the time of his death was altogether unknown, and that the uncertainty of it took no less than the compass of 30 years. And then they that were so utterly at a loss as to the time of his decease, and that for so long a space, were very likely to give a very wise account of the certain